Hello, I'm George Justice. On behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, the University of Georgia, it's the 17th day of August 2004, and we're at the Vanderklut Film Studios in Atlanta. We're here today with former Georgia Governor Carl E. Sanders to discuss the highlights of his most distinguished public service career and to provide an oral history documentation that will accompany his papers at the university. Governor Sanders is a former state legislator, state senator, floor leader, and president pro tem of the Georgia Senate before being elected to the governor's office in 1962. He was the first Georgia governor to be elected by popular vote and was, at age 37, the youngest governor in the nation. Governor Sanders led the state during a time of tremendous political, social, and economic changes in the 1960s and brought both energy and professionalism to a reform agenda unmatched by many of his predecessors. Currently, he is the chair and co-founding partner of Atlanta's prestigious law firm of Troutman Sanders and has been involved in numerous investments, corporate boards, and charities. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, Governor.
Glad to do it.
Well, let's begin with our first question. Governor Sanders, you grew up in Augusta, an old Georgia city with a very colorful history. And one of its most interesting and important legacies is the political leaders the city has provided to the state. And this is especially true in the 20th century. People like Tom Watson, Roy Harris, and even yourself rose to political prominence and became indelible figures in Georgia history. But even the local politics of the state's second capital has included a very contentious, often contentious political history with party strife. And I was wondering whether or not that during your youth, whether you were aware of any of the partisan struggles.
Well, Augusta, of course, politically was dominated and ruled by a party called the Cracker Party for years. And in fact, it got to the point where if you wanted to hold public office of any sort or you wanted to work for the city or the county, you had to go through the Cracker Party in order to achieve employment. I was aware of that as a young man growing up, but I was not so concerned about it until I came back after the war and after I went to law school and returned home to practice law. We had a situation where the safety commissioner, who used to be the head of the fire department, by the way, was named John Kennedy, controlled the Cracker Party. And after I had returned from the Air Force, I practiced law in a firm called Hammond and Kennedy, later Hammond, Kennedy and Sanders. And I was approached by some of the local elders who had decided that the Cracker Party needed to be broken up because it was like Tammany Hall in New York. And they prevailed upon me and a few other young veterans to run against the candidates proposed by the Cracker Party. That was my entry into politics. That was in 1954, I believe it was. And I ran as a member of the Independent Party, and we successfully broke up the Cracker Party's hold on the public offices in Richmond County.
As a youth, were you aware of, was politics a topic of household conversation in your home?
Politics was not a topic of household conversation in my home. My father was employed by Swift & Company, the meatpacking company. He grew up in Rex, Georgia, south of Atlanta. He went to work for the company in Atlanta, and then they transferred him to Augusta. He was with them for 44 years. At that when I was growing up, he didn't indicate any interest in politics, and I had no interest in politics. I was more concerned about whether I was going to go to the YMCA and learn how to swim or play basketball or football all the sports programs were not in the public schools, but were in the institutions like the Y. My father later, after I came back after the war, did become a county commissioner. And he became a county commissioner when the Cracker Party was still in its heyday. I learned in short order that that was not a very attractive job. Everybody wanted you to pave their driveway or pick up their trash or build a new road somewhere. So when I went to law school, I really had no political ambitions. My ambitions were to go through the University Law School and come back home and practice law. And when I was in law school, there were a lot of students who were already running for governor, running for lieutenant governor and offices. Most of them, for reasons that I never understood, never really achieved much success politically. But I came back to Augusta. I finished law school really in December of '47, and I returned in January of '48, joined the law firm. They worked me to death. I didn't have time to be worried about politics. I was worried about making a living. My wife, who I married in September, actually in August, not September. September was our anniversary. Anyway, my wife became seriously ill, so I had to try to provide for her. I not only had to practice law during the day, but I taught law school at the Augusta Law School 3 nights a week. So I was fully occupied and employed looking after my wife and practicing law. When I was asked about running for public office, I really didn't know whether I wanted to do that or not. I went home, I talked to my wife about it. She was not too happy about it, but she said, if you decide to do it, fine. I thought about it at length and decided that maybe the time had come for me to try to do something about what the situation was politically in my hometown. So I ran, and I luckily won, led the ticket, ran against a boy that I had played YMCA football with, another lawyer,
Billy Barton.
Billy Barton. Later, he was a district attorney at Augusta some years later. But we had a very vigorous race, but there were no monumental issues. The issue was, are you going to vote for the Cracker Party candidate or are you going to vote for the Independent Party candidate? And that's how I got started.
So was your lack of interest then in politics when you initially came back to Augusta because of the experience that you've seen your dad go through?
No, my lack of interest really was just what I said. I was so busy trying to make a living. I made $150 a month practicing law. I got a $600 bonus at the end of the year. In 1954, my first year's salary and bonus was $2,400. So you can imagine how I was trying to live. And in addition to that, my wife was sick. I finally took her to Johns Hopkins Hospital. They diagnosed her condition as regional ileitis. She had to have surgery. At one time earlier than that, right after we were married, she was in the hospital in Bullock County, her home of Statesboro. The minister told me one night that she had never lived through the night. I got down on my knees with the minister and prayed as I never prayed before. Fortunately, she lived through the night. She recovered. We didn't think that we would ever be able to have children. Fortunately, we had a daughter and a son. And so I was really busy trying to make a living more than trying to determine whether I wanted to get in politics. But I knew that a political job like the county commissioner was not everything that people thought it was cracked up to be, that it was a tough job. So when I got into the legislative race, it was different. I knew then that I would be going to Atlanta if I was successful, and I would be serving in the General Assembly of Georgia.
You've talked about before a couple of things that had a lot of impact on you in your youth, and one of those things was the YMCA.
The YMCA has had a great impact on my life. That's why I'm so interested in supporting the Y today, why I've tried to give back some of the material goods that I've acquired over the years back to the Y, because my mother took me down to the YMCA on Broad Street in Augusta, Georgia when I was about 7 or 8 years old. That's where I learned how to swim first. Secondly, I learned how to play basketball. Thirdly, I learned how to play football. I went to the YMCA camps in the summertime. They were not very sumptuous camps, but I went there and I developed an athletic ability, and it was as a result of that athletic ability that when I went to high school at Richmond Academy, I played football, and I eventually became the most valuable player on the football team. I became a member of the All-State GIAA football team. I earned a football scholarship to the University of Georgia. Had it not been for some of the programs and so forth that I learned from the YMCA, I doubt if I'd ever had an opportunity to get an athletic scholarship to go to Georgia. I don't know whether I would have gone to college, because my mother and my father neither one of them had ever gone to college. And my father's income working for Swift & Company was not such that you could just automatically put a kid through college. But I had worked in various and sundry forms before I went to college. When I was in the high school, my dad, since he was with Swift & Company, got me a job with the Big Star supermarket. I worked from 7 o'clock on Saturday morning to sometimes 8 or 9 o'clock at night. I started out sacking groceries. I wound up catching flour sacks in the back of the store. And when I was in college, I came home. I carried the mail during the Christmas holidays. The postmaster was a friend of my father's, and I knew him. When I was in school, even in grammar school, and during the summertime when the school was out, I had a paper route. I made 75 cents a week. I folded the papers in the morning, and I gave my mother 50 cents to save, and I spent a quarter. But I grew up in a wonderful middle-class family, but I grew up with a work ethic that I still have today. I grew up realizing that if you really wanted to get something, get ahead, you had to work. And things were not going to be handed to me on a silver platter, but if I was going to achieve anything in life, education or otherwise, I was going to have to go out and work for it. My mother was a very wonderful woman. She worked before she married my father. She was a cashier at S.H. Crescent Company in Augusta. And as I told you, my father was a salesman with Swift & Company. So growing up, when I did, I was born shortly before the big stock crash in 1929. I was born in 1925. And of course, I grew up in the Depression. Now, I didn't realize that the Depression was as severe as it really was. But what happened is that we had a little brick bungalow house on the corner of Johns and Wrightsboro Road that we were buying, that my family was buying. My father's salary was cut half in two, like many other people during the Depression. We had to give that house back to the bank or to the insurance company and rent it instead of purchasing it. But I never really realized that I was suffering as a part of that Depression. I didn't have wonderful play toys, but I had skates, and I had a football, and I could play cops and robbers, and we had some woods not too far down the street from where I lived, and we had wonderful opportunities. We had a nice neighborhood with a lot of kids. We had some football games in the street. We had a basketball rim in somebody's backyard. We just enjoyed a wonderful upbringing in my early years. I walked to school, to Montesana Grammar School. I served as a captain of the state patrol, the safety patrol. I'd get there early in the morning, make sure that the kids got across the street when they were coming to school and not get run over by an automobile. As I said earlier, I was active in the Y. I had a bicycle. I never had an automobile until I came back out of the service, and I bought a black Plymouth Coupe, paid $640 for the automobile, a brand new automobile, by the way. And you can imagine how that compares with automobiles today.
So these middle class values, the values that you learned from the Y, do you think any of those values translated over into your political career?
Yeah, they did. For instance, when I went to the paper route, you had to fold the papers in order to thaw them so you can hit them on somebody's front porch. I didn't know how to fold the paper into the form that you could thaw it. And one fellow that I got to be a good friend was a fellow named Charles Butler, who was an African American. He taught me how to fold my papers so that I could put them in my sack and I could ride my bicycle and throw the papers. I learned from him right off the bat that he was a good, solid individual and became a good friend of mine. Later, when I was governor, I appointed him to the Board of Education. He later became principal of one of the high schools in Augusta. And his name was Charles Butler, but they called him 98 because that was the route, the paper route that he threw. So I learned early on that it really didn't make any difference what the color of your skin was. It was what the people, the person that you dealt with, what they stood for and how they felt about you and how you felt about them. So I really learned early on that I didn't have any prejudice racially against anybody because of this color of their skin.
Tell me about the ROTC and what kind of impact that had on you as a
Well,
youth.
Richmond Academy, when I went there, was 1,000 boys, military, ROTC. We wore uniforms every day except Thursday, and that's when you're supposed to put them in the laundry and you could wear civilian clothes. I didn't fully realize what an impact that would have on my life. It was a fine school. The girls had a school several blocks down the street called Tubman High School, but Richmond Academy was fully all male. So I initially started in the military ROTC program. I became a corporal, a sergeant, later became an officer, later became one of the top officers at the high school. I was elected president of my freshman class in high school, and as I said, I played athletics. But I learned how to do left face, right face, about face, and all the oblique left, oblique right, and how to march in the parades, and how to take an old Springfield rifle and take it apart and put it back together. When I was an officer, I wore a saber and I had the tassels on your shoulders like a military thing. Well, all that was wonderful, and I enjoyed it, but what really happened was when I enlisted in the United States Air Force after I had gone to Georgia for a year and I was 17 and I had an alternate appointment to West Point that Congressman Paul Brown had awarded me, but I thought the principal who was at the Citadel would not take the principal, and he took the principal appointment to West Point, so that left me out. And so I went over and enlisted in the Naval Air Corps in Atlanta, and they told me that I had a problem, and I said, "What's my problem?" They said, "You're 17 years old, you've got to go home and get your parents' consent." So I went home the next week to get my parents' consent, thought about trying to land a plane on one of those aircraft carriers somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean, and I said, I don't believe I want to do that. I went out to Daniel Field in Augusta and enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Well, a month later, they called me up, and my first stop was Keesler Field in Biloxi, Mississippi. Well, that was just a beginning of a military career. I began to realize, though, that most of the people that I was in the service with had never had any military training whatsoever. They didn't know left face, right face, about face, or anything about the military. So when I went into the service, the military experience and training that I had in high school stood me very well. I later became the wing commander when I was in primary training, flight training. I had an official officer position all throughout my training to become a pilot, and I even had a choice at a time to decide where I wanted to go to take advanced training. But much of it was because all the military had come so easy to me and so difficult to some of the others that I was miles ahead of them militarily wise, and that was because of the ROTC program at Richmond Academy, which, by the way, was one of the finest schools in the country. It was actually originated before the adoption of the United States Constitution, and I went back some years ago to the 200th anniversary of that school. They had a faculty that was as good as any college faculty, and it was a wonderful educational process.
And this military experience led to your participation in World War II, is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, I was like every other young man at that time. I was anxious to go out and defend my country. I didn't want to stay at home, and I certainly didn't want to be classified as some people were back in those days. 4F is the terminology that was used. But I was anxious not only to go to the service and defend the country, but I wanted to learn how to fly. I wanted to be a pilot. I didn't know whether I could fly or not. I eventually went to Santa Ana, California, where they had pre-flight school, and they classified you bombardier, navigator, pilot. I took all of the tests, the written and the dexterity tests that they gave you, and I came back and thought, man, I'll never be a pilot. Some of my friends and buddies said, oh, that was easy, we're going to get to be pilots. Well, they wound up becoming bombardiers and navigators, and I wound up as a pilot. But there were a couple. In fact, there was one boy from Augusta that was with me at that time named Ben Popkin. Ben Popkin later, I think, became a navigator, and I think Ben's dead now, but Ben was in the military about the same time that I was. I went in enlisted at 17, went in at 18, became a B-17 bomber pilot at 19 years old, first pilot with a 10-man crew, and of course was in the military almost 3 years and returned to civilian life and went back to the University of Georgia.
Did the war itself have any impact on you?
Yeah, the war had a lot of impact on me. The first thing it did, it matured me far beyond my teenage years. I didn't have those 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old experiences that some of these kids have today, because I was in the service and we were at war, and I was trying to make the best of whatever I could do to help my country. What it did for me was when I was at Richmond Academy and I made reasonably good grades, I had some good grades in chemistry. So I thought, well, someday I'll be a chemist. I didn't know what a chemist did other than he was in a lab and had a uniform of some sort on and tried to look at test tubes and things. But I said that because I really didn't know anything else at that time that I wanted to do. While serving in the Air Force and in the military, I began to realize that I didn't want to be a chemist, and I began to think about what I really wanted to be. I think the war matured me to the extent that it gave me an opportunity to make some judgment calls that I don't believe I would have made if I had not gone to war. When I came out of the war, I knew that I did not want to be a chemist, but I had decided that I wanted to go to law school. The reason that I decided that I wanted to go to law school was because almost everybody that I heard about that were leaders and movers and shakers in the country at the time, in the world at the time, had some type of legal education or legal background. And I thought, if that's the kind of education that it takes for you to really become successful in life and what you want to do, that's what I want to do. So when I came back out of the Air Force, September of '45, I'd only had about one year of academic work in college, but they gave veterans an opportunity to take tests. And if you could pass the test in any subject that you took, they gave you credit, because we had all types of educational courses when I was training for a pilot. I passed enough tests to where I needed to take only 1 quarter to qualify for law school. So that was in '45. I played football that year. I returned to the football dormitory, went back on the football team, played in the Oil Bowl, which later became the Bluebonnet Bowl, and then I applied for law school. I went into law school in January of '46. It didn't take me but a few weeks to realize that I could not continue to play football and get through law school. Law school was very competitive, and I wanted to get in and get through law school as quickly as possible. So I went to Coach Butts and told him I was going to give up my athletic scholarship, and I was going to continue to take my GI Bill of Rights and go to law school. That's another thing. Before I went into the service, I played that year football under Wally Butts in the University of Georgia football team, and I promise you, I thought the war was easier than playing football for Wally Butts as a freshman, because it was tough. We not only had to play football on the football field, but we had rat courts at night, we had belt lines we had to run through, we had all kinds of of obstacles to stay on an athletic scholarship. But anyway, I got in law school. Law school normally takes 3 years. They allowed us to go around the clock, 12 months instead of taking the summer off. So I was able to finish law school in 2 years rather than 3 years. And back then, which they do not allow you to do now, you could take the bar exam if you felt like you could pass it. I went over at the end of my second year in law school, took the bar exam thinking I was taking it for practice with a couple of students who lived in the same house that I lived in out on Springdale Street. And I lucked up and passed the bar exam after my second year. I still had a year to go in law school, but I passed the bar exam, so I knew that I could practice law no matter what. That's when I got serious about marrying my wife, who was at Georgia at the time and who was in art school. And so we actually got married about 3 months before I finished law school, and about 6 or 8 months before I picked up my diploma.
You're talking about law school and you're talking about the football at Georgia. You were very competitive, weren't you?
I was very competitive, but I don't think I ever realized how competitive I was. I mean, I was competitive because I enjoyed what I was doing. I enjoyed athletics, I enjoyed flying, I enjoyed responsibility, I enjoyed work, but I was never obsessed and never felt like it, I'm a real competitive guy. I never felt that way.
Did you take that competitive spirit with you into politics?
Well, I think I did. I'm pretty sure I did, because I never would have run for governor if I hadn't taken that into politics with me, because when I went to the legislature in '55 and served 2 years in the House, I sat the first year and listened and kept my mouth shut and tried to find out how the General Assembly operated. Second year, I became a little more involved in taking on some issues. And then I went to the Senate. And of course, when I went to the Senate back in those days, except for Fulton County, rotated within 3 counties for each district. Fulton County had the only permanent senator. My district was the 18th senatorial district. It was Richmond, Glasscock, and Jefferson County. And I first served the first term in the Senate from Richmond County. After two years in the Senate from Richmond County, Jefferson County allowed me to serve and for the Jefferson County term, so I served a second term. The third term that I served in the Senate was for Glasscock County. They allowed me to serve as their senator. I was the only senator, and have been the only senator in the history of the state, that served in the Senate for 3 different counties, representing those counties. If I had not done that, I would not have been governor today. But as a result of that, I was Vandiver's floor leader in my first term in the Senate. I later became the president pro tem of the Senate. That's when I decided, before I was having to practice law and serve in the Senate at the same time, so I was going to the political arena when I had to in Atlanta, and I was coming home on the weekend and trying to cram in a week's law practice, and I decided that I either had to get in or get out of this political thing, because it was taking too much time to try to squeeze in both ventures. So I decided, well, I think I'll run for lieutenant governor. The county unit system was in full bloom. Segregation was still the law of the land, and I decided to run for lieutenant governor. Anyway, Peter Zach Gale had a closer relationship with Vandiver than I did, and he was going to run for the same office that I thought I would run for. So I started campaigning for lieutenant governor and going around the state and visiting the various counties. And I got to Dublin, Georgia one day, and the head of the newspaper down there was a gentleman by the name of Champion. And he said, "Have you heard the news today?" And I said, "No, what's the news today?" He said, "There's a former policeman in Atlanta who's got a law degree from a night school named Carl F. Sanders. He has announced that he's going to enter the race for lieutenant governor." Well, I knew what had happened. I mean, I knew that Peter Zach-Gehr and some of his friends had gotten this individual to offer for lieutenant governor, and that would leave me in the position of having people to go to the polls and decide whether they wanted to vote for Carl E. or Carl F. And that would have been impossible. So I said to Mr. Champion, well, you know, if that's the way they're going to play the game, I'll just run for governor. And that's when I got in the governor's race. Believe it or not, it was as a result of that particular incident. At that time, when I went back to Atlanta to my office, I had phone calls and I had people coming in saying, oh, don't do that. You're making a mistake. We've got the county locked up for you for lieutenant governor. We can't carry it for governor. You don't make that change. And I said, it's too late. I've decided to make the change. So I got in the governor's race. The county unit system was still in full force and effect. I didn't have any wonderful political machine. I was a bright young man on the white horse, but I had a long way to go to get to the governor's office. But I had made up my mind that I either had to get into the political arena full time and serve the people of Georgia, or go back to Augusta and practice law and be satisfied with that.
That was a very bold move, going from
Well, it was a crazy move when I think about it in retrospect, because I had no campaign funds of any consequence. I knew that I had friends in my hometown that would help raise money, but I really didn't have, I was not a Talmadge member of the Talmadge dynasty. I was not a member of the Russell family. I was from Augusta, which was one of the metropolitan areas in the state. The county unit system favored the rural counties and favored the candidates who ran from rural counties. So I had a lot of obstacles, but I had a lot of ambition, and I had a lot of drive, and I had a lot of determination, and I was willing to work hard. So I thought, you know, everything else being equal, it's just another opportunity to exceed, and I got in the race.
And in all fairness, you had made quite a name for yourself in the legislature, hadn't you?
Well, I had, and I had gone out on the legislative tour as when I was president pro tem of the Senate the year before I announced. And at that time, the big question was, what are we going to do about the public schools in Georgia? The Supreme Court, the Brown versus Board of Education, had already been decided. No longer were we supposed to have segregated schools, but the separate but equal doctrine that the Supreme Court for so many years used to keep segregation in the country had been done away with. I realized, thinking about my own life and thinking about the lives of other people, that you could not have a state with nothing but private schools for the people who could afford them, and have public schools, if any public schools at all, that would be subpar. So I took the position that if I was elected to any public office in this state, we were not going to close the public schools. Frank Twitty, who was the member of the House that was on the tour with me, initially took the position that we had to close the public schools, and we had to build private schools, and we had to succeed from the union or whatever we had to do. But by the time we got through traveling around the state and speaking 3 times a day in various cities and counties, he finally came to the conclusion that I was right and he was wrong, and we both wound up advocating that the public schools of this state would stay open no matter what. Now that translated into the situation with Governor Vanderbilt, who was confronted with the problem of whether he was going to allow the 2 African American students, Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter, was going to allow them to enter the University of Georgia. He called 50-some-odd leaders, legislative leaders, business leaders, political leaders, out to the mansion one night and said, I've got to make a decision about closing the University of Georgia, and I want to know how you all feel about it. He went around the room and took the statement from all 50 people. 48 out of the 50 said, close the University of Georgia. Frank Twitty and I said, do not close the University of Georgia. You can't do that. We can't wind up with a generation of illiterates in this state. Vanderbilt took our advice and kept the University of Georgia open, but it was that close. There was only 2 of us out of the 50 people that he called in to give him advice and counsel that were willing to stand up and say, let's keep the schools open.
Why do you think he listened to the 2 of you over everyone else?
Well, I think inherently, he felt like we felt that you couldn't have these private schools. But he had campaigned and gotten Roy Harris, being one of his supporters when he was elected governor, had gotten him and a few other people to make this wonderful speech about no, not one, not ever one, will we ever admit to the public schools of Georgia. And I think he was confronted politically with that in mind, and he knew that he would be going against what he had said in a political campaign, so he had a lot of reservations. But basically and fundamentally, he was a good man, is a good man, and I think he understood that education is the centerpiece of anybody's life, and that we couldn't have private schools on the one hand for white students and public schools, if we had any public schools at all, on the other hand, for black students. So I think he took our advice. Twitty was well known in South Georgia from Camilla. I was from Augusta, and I think he believed that we had analyzed the situation properly, and he followed our recommendation.
Education had been high on your agenda early on in your political career.
That's because I had to work for it. That's because if I hadn't had to work for it, I wouldn't have gotten where I'd been in life, and I realized early on in life that the only free people that I know anything about are people who've had the benefit of an education. When you're educated, you're free to make choices. You're free to analyze situations. When you're uneducated, you're blocked. You're not free to do very much of anything, and you are imprisoned in your own life because of a lack of education.
In fact, you helped get Augusta College established.
That's right. Augusta College started out as, they had a junior college attached to Richmond Academy, a local junior college. And some of the faculty members there used to also teach in the high school. When I was in the legislature, property that formerly was known as the United States Arsenal property up on Walton Way in Augusta, a beautiful tract of land of 50-something acres with buildings on it, had been declared surplus. I went to work with the local people there to get that land transferred to the local Board of Education to move the junior college from the Richmond Academy building up to the Arsenal property. I also went to work when I was in the legislature to get that 2-year junior college into the university system, to become a part of the University of Georgia system. I was able to do that. When I was elected governor, I made it, along with 3 or 4 other junior colleges, into a 4-year community college, and created another 10 or 12 junior colleges throughout the state. When I was in the Senate and serving in the Senate, I went to California. I studied the community college system in California. Out there you could go to school free of charge in any community college that you wanted to enter. And I came back and realized that we couldn't educate everybody at the University of Georgia in Athens or at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And so I came up with the idea that we needed to create a series of junior colleges, community colleges, where kids could stay at home, could go the first 2 years, and then back in that day and time, transfer to a 4-year college if they wanted to. Many of those junior colleges today are senior colleges. And of course, that program turned out to be a wonderful educational program for the state of Georgia. At the same time we created these junior colleges, we created these vocational technical schools, which is a different type of educational process, where kids could learn a trade, learn how to operate machinery, and if they wanted to, if they were not going for an academic degree in the junior college or the community college, they could go back and forth between the vocational technical school and the liberal arts junior college or senior college. It was a wonderful educational program. For instance, in Augusta, a kid can go to high school, go to college, go to medical school, and get a medical degree without ever leaving home.
Another issue the top of your agenda early on in was honesty and efficiency in government.
That's right. I was on the Honesty and Efficiency Commission, a committee that was set up when Marvin Griffin was governor and Ernie Vanderbilt was lieutenant governor, and I was a member of the Senate. And I saw firsthand what could happen when people decided to become corrupt and use the resources of the government that they and the offices that they served in for corrupt purposes. So I realized that you couldn't serve in government if unless you were going to be totally honest, and if you couldn't serve in government and be partially honest, you had to be absolutely honest, and you had to make sure that whatever decision you made was made with an honest intention and an honest purpose, and not to feather somebody else's nest or to try to do something that would benefit you personally for something that you should not be entitled to.
And that was one of the focal points of your platform for governor, wasn't it?
That was a big focal point for my platform for governor, because the Griffin administration, when Governor Griffin was in there, had a very corrupt administration. They, Reader's Digest had written an article, "Never have so few robbed so much from so many." And they had rural roads that were built with a little grease on the road, and that was about it. They bought gasoline saving machines that came off of boats and tried to put them on trucks. They favored some of their cronies and all kinds of purchasing of equipment and so forth. And that was one of the big issues in my campaign, along with the racial issue.
So how were you able to garner all the support that you did in your campaign for governor, enough to win? How were you able to win that race?
Well, I think, another thing happened too in the meantime. After I got in the race, after we were campaigning, the county unit system went out of the window. So this was the first time that we had the popular vote. I just outworked the rest of the people. I outworked Marvin Griffin. I went from morning till noon till night every day. I campaigned in every county in the state. I was supported by many of the people that I'd gone to college with. I was able to get the support of Mills B. Lane, who headed up the C&S Bank in Atlanta at the time. He had initially was going to support Garland Byrd, who was a lieutenant governor, who had a heart attack and dropped out of the race. He helped me raise financial funds. Later, when Byrd dropped out of the race, who Ernie Vanderbilt was supporting up until then, I got the support of some of the Vanderbilt people, such as Jim Gillis Sr. and some of them. But basically and fundamentally, I just outworked the Griffin crowd. I knew that if I went every day as hard as I could go to as many places as I could go, that they were going to call him up eventually and say, "You better come down here to this county and talk to some of these people. This young man has been in here shaking hands and garnering votes. And if you don't come down here, we don't know what's going to happen." He had the politicians. I had the people in that race.
When you won that election, you were part of a whole generation of young politicians across this country.
Generation of young men and women who had returned from World War II, who now wanted to do something that they had seen the rest of the world. They had fought for the freedom of the world, and they wanted now to make some of these changes in their local communities. And they were active, and they went to the polls and voted, when before the only people that generally went to the polls and voted were the professional politicians, who had a hard core of supporters, most of whom they gave jobs to after they got elected.
And you also were part of that generation that had a special connection to John Kennedy.
Well, John Kennedy was a young, handsome, energetic senator who decided to run for president after he had tried to get the nomination several years before. He was a returning World War II veteran, and of course he had a lot of charisma, and a lot of people like myself and others of that age and that ilk liked what we saw in John Kennedy and supported him. And he carried Georgia, percentage-wise, with the greatest percentage of any state in the Union. But he, of course, his career was eclipsed by this assassination. I knew him well. He did me some great favors. One great favor he did for me was something that I will never forget. After I was elected in August to the primary of 1963, before I took 62, before I took office in January of 63, Fort Gordon, which was located in Augusta, Richmond County, was the biggest payroll in my county. And the United States Defense Department announced that they were going to close Fort Gordon. Well, I said, this can't happen. I've just been elected governor. I can't afford to let the biggest payroll in my hometown get shut down. So I went to see Senator Russell, who was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate and who was a senior senator from Georgia. And I said, Senator Russell, I've just been elected. I can't allow Fort Gordon to be closed. Can you help me try to keep them from closing Fort Gordon? Senator Russell said, I'm sorry, but I've already signed off on the base closings in Georgia. There's nothing I can do about it now. I said, thank you very much. I decided to go see President John F. Kennedy. I went to see John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office at the White House, explained to him my predicament, told him that I was elected and they were about to shut the fort down. Could he help me? He said, let me see what I can do. I went back to Atlanta. A week later, he called me up and said, the order to close Fort Gordon has been rescinded. I said, can I make that announcement publicly? He said, yes. I made the announcement. It made Senator Russell mad because I had gone to the president. But John Kennedy was the one who kept Fort Gordon from being moved from Fort Gordon, Georgia, to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Later, several years later, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey was moved to Fort Gordon, Georgia, and it became the largest military telecommunications center in the world. But had it not been for John F. Kennedy more than 40 years ago, Fort Gordon, Georgia would have been shut down and would have been moved to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey.
But you actually had a fairly close relationship with him.
Well, I had a close relationship with him. I did. I visited him many times before he was assassinated. I had a very close relationship with Lyndon Johnson, who later became president. I campaigned for the Democratic ticket in 1964 when I was the only statewide official that was willing to campaign for the ticket. I knew at the time that it was not the popular thing to do, but I had been elected by the Democratic Party. I was head of the Democratic Party. Senator Russell went to Spain and spent the summer inspecting military bases. Senator Talmadge went underground and didn't surface for the campaign. So I was about the only statewide candidate. When they would come to Georgia, they would stand up and appear on a platform and try to help them get elected. Goldwater carried Georgia, and there wasn't much I could do about it. But that still, I knew that it was my responsibility. I had been elected head of the party. I had been elected by the Democratic Party as governor, and I felt like it was my responsibility to continue to lead the party and not abandon the party as a lot of the other public officials did.
Is it true that John Kennedy had considered putting you on the ticket in '64?
Well, I've heard that rumor.
Johnson?
I've heard that story. There was always a very bad relationship between Bobby Kennedy, who was John Kennedy's brother and who was, of course, the Attorney General. He and Lyndon Johnson didn't get along at all. And I think Bobby Kennedy would float names every day about who they were going to put in the place of Lyndon Johnson when Jack Kennedy ran for re-election. And my name might have been put in there along with others, but I never had any serious consideration, to my knowledge, about being on the ticket. Nobody had come to me and said, "Now we're going to put you on the ticket." I think Bobby was using that for leverage to keep Lyndon Johnson in line for the programs that he and his brother were advocating.
But that ever create any tensions between you and Lyndon Johnson?
None whatsoever. In fact, I sat in the family's box when he made his inaugural speech to the Congress. I was the only other outside member of the family with one other exception, and that was Mayor Dick Daley from Chicago. He and I were the two non-members of the family who sat there. I hunted at the Johnson Ranch. Johnson was good to the state of Georgia. Johnson, later part of our state, qualified for the Appalachian region, and we got hundreds and millions of dollars for hospitals, roads, schools, and all sorts of things through the Johnson administration. Dora, I think it was, that the hurricane hit the Georgia coast, just about tore up the whole seaboard, the whole Georgia coast. He allowed me to put huge amounts of rock along the coastal lines of Georgia. Johnson's administration paid for every dime of it. The state didn't cost the state a nickel, but it saved the Georgia coast. The people of Georgia benefited from Lyndon Johnson's administrations in many ways.
Your relationship with Johnson, did that affect your relationship with Dick Russell?
No. Dick Russell and Johnson were very close when Johnson was the majority leader of the Senate. And based on some tapes that I've been hearing recently, they still, even after the Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act, Dick Russell apparently still had a cordial relation with Lyndon Johnson. But I think the relationship that they used to have before Johnson advocated the Civil Rights Bill had tempered their relationship to a great degree. But it did not affect my relationship with Johnson, and it didn't affect, I didn't have a close relationship with Dick Russell.
You didn't?
No. And when I was in the Senate, another experience that I had, when I was in the state Senate the first time, they made me head of the Veterans Affairs Senate Committee, which was a do-nothing, know-nothing committee. But anything it had to do with the state military was involved with it. And we lost a Air National Guard pilot flying an old F-84 Dog, they called him back then, and he died. He crashed. And I went to Washington to see Congressman Carl Vinson, who was the head of the Armed Services Committee in the House, and who absolutely, built the United States Navy as part of his duty as a chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and told him about the loss of the pilot. And he asked me what I wanted, and I said, I want 50 new aircraft for the Air National Guard of Georgia. And he said, what kind of aircraft are you talking about? And the hottest aircraft in the world at that time was a F-100. So I said, I want 50 F-100s, and he laughed and said, what'd you say, Senator? And I said, I want 50 F-100s. He laughed and he said, well, we'll see what we can do. I knew, and he knew, that I was not going to get 50 F-100s. But a few weeks later, I got a call from the head of the National Guard Bureau in Washington, who I could tell was mad as a wet hen because I'd gone to Congressman Vinson, and told me that they were going to send us new aircraft, F-86s, which were much more modern than the F-84s. They were not F-100s, but they were going to send those aircraft. Now, this was in the 50s. This was still when the schools were segregated in Georgia and everything else was segregated. So sometime later, I got a notification that they were going to deliver the first F-86 aircraft out at Dobbins Air Base in Marietta. And so we had a big event. We had bands and we had people, and here comes this F-86 aircraft in, and he rolled. It's a beautiful plane. And I thought, what a wonderful plane. This is our first aircraft. And the band's playing and all that, and the aircraft taxis up to the ramp. The pilot pulls back the canopy, and out steps the blackest pilot you've ever seen. And I knew that Air National Guard general said, I'm going to deliver the aircraft, but I'm going to deliver it with a pilot that they wish we hadn't delivered it with. It was funny. And of course, he was a good pilot, and we were glad to get the airplane. And of course, subsequently to that point, all the racial discord and so forth began to heat up, and it was in full bloom when I became governor.
Back to Dick Russell, and you considered running against him in '66, is that right?
'66, I thought about it. But Senator Russell was suffering from emphysema. And I didn't know whether he was going to offer for re-election. He had come to the legislature to make a speech, and he used to have to carry one of these oxygen bottles around with him. So I didn't know whether he was going to offer for re-election or not. I thought about it. But he was determined to continue his service to the people of the state and to the nation. And I finally decided that that was not what I wanted to do for two reasons. One was it would have been a very difficult race. And the second reason was my wife was not interested in me going to Washington. My children were teenagers. That was '66. That was when the hippie thing had started. And I had seen too many families that had left their home states and moved to Washington for a year, and then the family would move back, and the senator would stay up there, the congressman would stay up there, and they'd wind up in the divorce courts, or the kids would get in trouble. So I decided that rather than do that, I had an opportunity to build a law firm, and I decided that I would build a law firm, and if I wanted to get back into public life, that I'd run for governor again 4 years later, because I had to leave the office for 4 years under the Constitution at that time.
When you went into the governor's office, let's talk about goals versus achievements. What did you hope to accomplish when you became governor?
Well, I hoped to do as much as I could possibly do within 4 years that anybody had ever thought about doing. And I hoped to reform the educational system of the state, particularly the higher education system. I hope to bring more industry in than anybody had ever brought in before. I hope to elevate the teachers' salaries of the state. I hope to build airports. I campaigned in a little 250 horsepower Piper Comanche aircraft. The first time anybody in Georgia, a politician, had ever campaigned in an aircraft. And we only had 30 paved airports in Georgia. Most of them were auxiliary fields from World War II. When I left office, we had 100 paved airports in Georgia. We built 70 paved airports. All I ever asked the county commissioner to do was furnish me a strip of land, 3,500 feet long. I'd put up half the money, the state would, the federal government would put up half the money, and we'd build an airstrip. And so we had the #1 airport development program in the country for 4 straight years. That brought more industry into this state than you can ever imagine, because people before were not thinking about flying to Atlanta and then driving 2 hours to look at an industrial site in a rural county. But if they could fly to that rural county, land on that 3,000-foot strip of airport, they would go out and look at the industrial sites in those counties, and many of them built plants that never would have been built in Georgia.
Was there anything that you had hoped to accomplish that you didn't achieve?
No, I accomplished much more than I ever thought I was able to accomplish. I had one disappointment, but it was not because I didn't accomplish what I sought out to do. And that was I decided to rewrite the Georgia Constitution, which had not been rewritten in years, and there was no place in the state where you could sit down and actually read the Georgia Constitution, because it had been amended thousands of times. So I had a special session to rewrite the Constitution and remodel the election laws. And that was in 1965 or 6 in the summer. And of course, I rewrote the Constitution, which was one of the toughest jobs that you could ever have, and I rewrote the election laws. Immediately, somebody filed a petition saying the legislature was malapportioned. They went to the federal court, and the federal court, to this day, I'll never understand, it was the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They decided that both of those pieces of legislation had been done in the same session, that it was all right to rewrite the election laws, that they were not going to declare them invalid because of malapportionment, but it was not permissible to rewrite the Constitution, and they were going to declare that unconstitutional because it was malapportioned. I appealed that decision from the court, but by the time the Supreme Court of the United States voted upon it, which was too late to get it on the general ballot in '66, I was not able to get it on the ballot. That was a big disappointment because that was a big piece of work that I had done, and I was unable to get it finished.
You were succeeded by Lester Maddox as governor, and the 1966 gubernatorial race was contentious and controversial.
Very much so.
And with the Republican Party running Bo Calloway as their nominee, and with Ellis Arnell and Lester Maddox. James Cook, your biographer, writes that you had some very strong reservations about that election.
Well, what happened in that election, the truth of the matter is, Bo Calloway, if he had played his political cards correctly, would have been elected governor. But Bo Calloway ran as a Republican candidate, and of course Ellis Arnold, not only Ellis Arnold and Lester Maddox, but I think Ernie Vanderbilt at one time was in that race. There were several candidates that were trying to run for governor. Maddox wound up in a runoff with Ellis Arnold in the Democratic primary. Bo Calloway had no opposition in the Republican primary, and he was supported by a lot of the business leaders in Atlanta, some of whom were my good friends. And Ellis Arnold had a campaign deficit after the runoff. My recollection is something like $50,000 that he still owed for his campaign and his runoff against Maddox. Some of Ellis Arnold's friends in Atlanta went to see Bo Calloway and said, if you'll help us when you get elected governor, pay off Governor Arnold's campaign deficit, we'll throw our support to you. For reasons that I never understood, Bo Calloway declined that opportunity. They said, well, if you're not going to help us get rid of Ellis Arnold's campaign deficit if you get elected governor, we're going to run Ellis Arnold again as a write-in candidate in the November general election. That's what they did. Ellis Arnold polled enough write-in votes to keep either Bo Calloway or Lester Maddox from getting more than 50% of the vote as required by the Constitution and the election laws. Under those circumstances, at that time, the Constitution said in that event, the election of the governor will then go to the House of Representatives, and the governor will be elected by the members of the House of Representatives, each of whom will have one vote. The Democrats were not very happy about Maddox, but they didn't want Calloway as a Republican governor. So the Democrats sort of held their nose and voted for Maddox, and that's how he got appointed governor, and Calloway got defeated for governor in that particular situation. Subsequently, the Constitution was changed, and now today, if you have that type of situation, you have a special election. It does not go into the House of Representatives.
Tell me about Maddox's stint as governor. How would you rate it? How would you characterize it?
Maddox did pretty well. He did better than I thought he was going to do for one reason. All these people that had been called Maddox supporters, that had been running around with axe handles and egging him on in his campaign, he realized that they were not qualified to hold the high positions of office in the state government. So he kind of took the position that he was not going to change many people that were already running departments in the state government. In fact, I made up the budget for the 2 years, his first 2 years, and he didn't change a bit of that budget. So I really had 6 years of budget submission for the state. But his position was that he was going over and take the governor's office and protect the public from those scalawags that he might find in government, but he was not going over there and try to change all the offices and change the people. So he left most of the people that had worked with me in office, and he didn't meddle too much with it. The only thing he did that I regret was that he allowed the General Assembly of Georgia to take over much of the executive power that the governor previously had. And they created their own budget, and they became independent. And ever since Lester Maddox, the governor of Georgia has been a lot less politically forceful than he was when I was in office.
Do you think if Maddox had been a stronger executive that would not have happened?
I think if he had ever held public office, I think if he'd ever been in the General Assembly like I had been before I was elected governor, I think even if he had been mayor of Atlanta or something, I think he would have been much stronger in controlling the executive power and not allowing it to be taken over by the legislature.
You think that a strong executive could have survived much longer in Georgia?
Yeah, I do. I think that's the best form of government. I think the governor goes out and lays his program out in front of all the people of the state. The people vote on that program. And I think the governor ought to have the responsibility of implementing the program that the people have voted on, rather than the way it is now. The legislators, they don't represent the entire state. They represent their own county or district, and they now put programs through the legislature that the governor may not want, or the people may not necessarily have ever approved.
Well, after Maddox's term as governor, you decided to run again.
Yeah.
Talk about that campaign.
Well, that was not a very nice campaign. I stayed in Atlanta and built a law firm. I probably should have gone back to Augusta and returned into my law firm in Augusta rather than doing what I did. But I had an opportunity to represent companies and clients in the Atlanta area that were national, and they were much more interested in good legal representation than I would have had if I'd gone back to Augusta. If I just wanted to be a politician the rest of my life, I probably should have gone back to Augusta. So I didn't do that. Jimmy Carter, who had been in the Senate when I was governor, and who had been in the race in '66 with Maddox and that group, and who had failed in that race, spent 4 years traveling around the state planting seeds to run for governor in 1970. I thought, just like many people think, that the people of the state or the people of the country have a memory of the things that you did when you were in public life and the accomplishments that you were able to achieve for their benefit, and that I had such a good administration, no scandals, a lot of progress, a lot of opportunity for people that they'd never had before, that to run in 1970, that would give me a good edge to be reelected. Jimmy Carter, much to my chagrin, took the position that he was going to play the racial card. He took the position that he was supporter of George Wallace, which I was not, and that I had not allowed George Wallace to come over and take over the Georgia legislature, that he would if he was elected. I happened to, while I was in Atlanta, happen to own a part of the Atlanta Hawks basketball team. They took pictures when they won the Western Division in the locker room with me and some of the ball players pouring champagne over my head, and these were African American ball players. Carter's campaign took those pictures and all, spread them all over South Georgia, all over the rural counties of the state, and took the position that I was a rich Atlanta lawyer, and I was a one who favored integration, that he was a southern peanut farmer in South Georgia who supported segregation and who was a big friend of George Wallace. And I got positioned as an Atlanta lawyer who supported people regardless of their race, and he put himself in the position as a South Georgia farmer who supported the white race and not the black race. And that's how that campaign was run. It was a mean, dirty campaign, but it was politics. And the truth of the matter is, everything is fair in love and war and politics. Now, the irony of it, if you go to the Carter Library today and ask to see the gubernatorial papers of the 1970 campaign, they will tell you that those papers are still being processed some 30, 40 years later, because immediately when Jimmy was elected governor, at his inaugural speech, he said, forget about all this racial stuff that I've been running on and all this stuff that I've been telling you to vote for me on. That's not me. The greatest friend that I've got in America today is Martin Luther King Jr., and I believe in integration, and I don't believe in segregation, and I ran that kind of race to get elected, and now I'm going to put that aside and operate in a completely different manner.
And he used race and class, didn't he? Because
Yeah.
he called you Cufflinks Carl.
Oh yeah. Well,
Yeah.
of course, he claimed that I was wealthy, and that finally we disclosed our net worth, and he was worth more money than I was. But for the time being, I was a rich lawyer living in Atlanta. And the truth of the matter is, too, nobody up until that point running for statewide office had ever lived in Atlanta as their permanent home. All the office holders that ran the state government lived outside of Atlanta in some other section of the state.
So how would you rate Carter's stint as governor?
Carter didn't have a very good gubernatorial experience, but I got to say this in his behalf. One of the reasons he didn't have such a good 4 years was Lester Maddox was his lieutenant governor. And Lester Maddox and Jimmy Carter disliked each other tremendously, and they never got along, and every day they'd have a fight over what kind of legislation that they were going to try to entertain, and Maddox would be in one corner and Carter would be in another, and that went on for 4 years. So he didn't have too much of an opportunity to do too many things without having to run through Maddox and try to stomp him down in order to get something passed.
What was the source of tension between them?
Well, Maddox believed Carter was hypocritical and dishonest when he ran as a segregationist and then turned into an integrationist. And Maddox says, you know, I'm a segregationist, have been, always will be, and Carter has changed his stripes and his colors, and I dislike the man because he hadn't been honest. You know, Maddox, for all of his faults, one of the things that he believed in, and one of the things that I think he tried to do, was he tried to be honest, no matter how different or how unpolitical some of his views might have been. He at least said, this is my honest viewpoint. I'm not going to change on you if you elect me, and I'm not going to be something that I said I was not before I ran for the office.
How do you explain Carter's winning the presidency in '76?
He just absolutely outworked the rest of the candidates who thought they were going to sit back and somebody was going to nominate them and put them into the Democratic nomination. Carter, I'll say this for he and his family and his friends, he started, that's another reason why he didn't have as much opportunity to do as many things as governor as perhaps he would have been if he had not been already looking to run for president. The last couple of years of his tenure as governor, he was out in this country campaigning for president. And of course, a lot of these people who in Washington who sit in the Congress thought they could sit in the Senate and the House and never have to go out into the rural areas or the other parts of the country, but they were just going to go to the convention and they'd get nominated. Carter just outworked him. He out-politicked him, and he got the nomination of some of these states that they never dreamed he'd get, and that's how he got the nomination for president. People never thought he had a chance, but he just absolutely outworked and out-campaigned the rest of the people who thought they were going to be president.
And it doesn't seem that the press seized on this characteristic of Carter, the switching from one side to the other.
Well, they didn't do that in the presidential race. He had already spent his 4 years of redeeming his self as a racial George Wallace supporter when he ran in '70, and the press didn't hop on him for that when he ran for president. What they did do, they gave him the benefit of the doubt that he was an outsider, and all these other people who thought they were going to run for president at that time were insiders inside the Beltway in Washington, and Washington was in such a mess that it was time for an outsider to come in and clean it up. And that's what Carter ran on primarily, is I'm not one of the insiders in Washington, but I'm an outsider, I'm a governor, and if you'll elect me, I'll go to Washington and I'll straighten out this Washington mess that's created by all these people who spend all their time inside the Beltway.
Do you think he was a better president than he was a governor?
No, I think he had a tough time being president. I think he tried to be a good president, but I think he got caught up in inflation, and I think he got caught up in the Iran hostage situation. I think he had a lot of problems that were not necessarily his making, but interest rates during the Carter's administration for president got up to be 20%. People didn't have jobs. People couldn't afford to borrow money. The hostages got taken over in Iran. He just had a huge, in politics, let me tell you something, you can be smart, but you got to have a little luck along with it. The economy went bad. He couldn't turn the economy around. The hostage situation went bad. They even waited to release the hostages till the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in as a president. They could have released him earlier. They didn't do that. And Jimmy went up to Washington, I think, with the idea that he would straighten out a lot of the old pros that had been around. And he had a terrible relationship with Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, and some of the other old Washington pros. He liked to micromanage too much. In my opinion, if he had delegated more authority to more people, he probably would have had a better administration. I think he's learned that since he left the presidency, and I think he has done some rather remarkable things following his tenure as president. He certainly has continued to campaign and work harder as an ex-president than any ex-president I've ever known. Some people, some of these sitting presidents, I think, have sort of resented maybe some of his meddling, as they would put it. But he's been out here trying to relieve problems in the world. Most presidents, ex-presidents, go back to their ranch or go back to their home and don't do that. He's taken a different approach, and I think as a result, he's been elevated. History has elevated him higher as an ex-president than they give him credit for being a president or a governor.
After 1970, you considered one more office in 1972. Briefly, you considered a run for the Senate, didn't you?
Well, that's when Russell died.
Right.
And I thought about it again. But I had a good law firm being built at that time, and I was involved with my family, as I always am, and I decided again that I didn't want to go to Washington. I had talked to too many governors that I had served with when I was governor, some of which went to Washington. And they told me, and just like most people know, that you got to sit in the Senate for about 12 years and vegetate before you get enough influence and power to do anything. And I was helping build a bank, and I had some other business ventures that I was involved in. So Sam Nunn, who had never run for statewide office and who was a member of the General Assembly, who was Carl Vinson's nephew, decided he was going to run. And I liked Sam Nunn, knew him, and I took Norman Underwood, who was one of my law partners, and asked him to go over and help Sam Nunn run his campaign, which he did. And Sam Nunn got elected to the United States Senate and served 24 years in the Senate, came out with his reputation intact. And I never regretted making the decision in '72 that I thought about going to the Senate again, because most of the people, as I said earlier, that I knew that who'd served as governor, and when you serve as governor and you're chief executive and you can run the state, it's like running a big business. That's different than being one of 100 in the Senate, and where you sit there and hope you can get your name on a bill, and in the meantime, you just are almost vegetating for years and years, and that's not my demeanor. That's not my personality. And they told me, most of them said after they served one term, they wanted to go back home. Herman Talmadge, when he left the governor's office and served in the Senate for a number of years, every 6 years when every 4 years when the governor's race would come up, you'd always see where Talmadge is thinking about coming home and running for governor again. It's much more fun to be governor than it is to be a United States senator.
Why didn't you consider running for governor again?
Why didn't I consider running for governor again?
Right.
Well, I felt like that I had accomplished a great deal as governor the first time. I felt like that the people had decided that they were going to elect somebody else to be governor, and I still, at that time, when I ran in 1970, I still had in my mind a lot of programs that I still wanted to do more about. But by the time that I got an opportunity to run again, I had gotten so immersed in my own personal affairs, in my family's affairs, in building a bank and building a law firm and getting involved in some real estate transactions, that I felt like, well, I gave the people the best I could give them for the 4 years that I was governor. Now the people selected somebody else, rather when I ran for re-election. I'm going to look after my family and look after my personal business, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made, because otherwise I don't know what I'd be doing today, but I wouldn't be where I am today with my family, with my business, with my law firm. None of those personal accomplishments I don't think would have taken place if I had continued just to devote my time to the political arena.
So you weren't really dissuaded by the bitterness of the 70 campaign?
No, politics, I've been there and done that, and I've got a good record, and I put 60 cents out of every dollar into education. Nobody's ever done that before or since, and I accomplished all those things, and I thought too, if I go back 10 years later, I may not be able the Maddox thing, the legislature had taken over the power. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that I accomplished when I was governor. And instead of having the record that I had, I'd probably have a good record back then and a mediocre record later. So I said, look, the people decided that they wanted somebody else to carry the flag in 1970. I'm going to look after my personal business and be happy, and I got no regrets and I got no ill will toward anybody.
What would you, if you had to put it in a sentence or two, what is your political legacy? What have you left to?
The most progressive administration in the history of Georgia in all aspects of the operation of the state government. If you look at every department in the state government and you look at the accomplishments that were made and the programs that I inaugurated, nobody has come close, even when the governors served 8 years, have come close to putting into full force and effect what I put into full force and effect in all the areas of government, and done so without scandal, and done so. I left $140 million in surplus funds when I left the office. Nobody had ever done that before.
In the end, do you think that you were more affected by Georgia politics, or that you affected Georgia politics more?
Well, I think I affected Georgia politics more in that a lot of things back before my term as governor were sort of accepted. Politicians, could do things that personal benefits and things that politicians today wouldn't dare do, but they could get away with it. Now, Gene Talmadge, when he ran for governor, they said, you stole so many bales of cotton when you were the Commissioner of Agriculture. And he said, yeah, I stole them, but I stole them for you. And the people said, fine, and voted for him. Well, you couldn't get away with any kind of statement like that today, and I think that I was at the crossroad at the time in history when the political arena in this state changed. I think too, because of that particular time with all the civil rights and all the changes that took place, I took the high road. And some of the other southern states around us, Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, they took a different road. But because I took the high road and I accepted the law of the land as we being a government of laws and not a government of men, I think Georgia came into the limelight. At that particular time when I was elected governor, Birmingham, Alabama was better situated economically to take the leadership of the South than Atlanta, Georgia. But because we took the high road when I was elected governor and accepted the law of the land and eliminated all these racial barriers and things, I opened up the National Guard, I opened up the State Patrol. Atlanta and Georgia took the leadership in the South. People living in other parts of America moved to Georgia that never would have moved here before. Educators came into our schools that never would have moved into Georgia and taken jobs in our schools. We captured the leadership of the South, and that's what we have today. And I think I happen to be at the right time with the right attitude about what we needed to do in the state in order to do that.
Many of the issues that were on the table in the 60s, such as the national and state economy, civil rights, international relations, are still at the forefront of controversy today.
Yeah, the racial business is still very much involved, and people don't call it racial, but it is. It's still involved. And the economic situation is, of course, very much involved today. The foreign relations is a tremendous problem.
Do you think we've made progress since the 60s?
I think we in the South, and particularly in Georgia, I think Georgia has made a lot of progress, but I'm not so sure many other places have made as much progress as we have.
Why do you think Georgia has
because I think we had more enlightened leadership at the critical time than other parts of the country had. And I think enlightened leadership brought on more enlightened leadership later on. And it's just like anything else, you get into the habit of enlightened people seeking public office, they give you a better form of government and a better economic opportunity than if you put people in there who are not enlightened, who still want to live in the past, and who still want to fight the Civil War all over again and all that sort of stuff, who still want to keep this country isolated from the rest of the world. I think we fortunately went down a more enlightened road in this state than most any other state that I know anything about.
What do you think is the most critical issue facing us today, politically speaking?
Politically, I think the most critical issue is that we are not looked upon today in the world in the same manner that we used to be looked upon. We used to be admired and respected all over the world for our political beliefs, our economic beliefs, and everything else. I think we are today more isolated economically and more isolated foreign relation-wise than we've ever been. I used to take my grandchildren when I was out of office, at least on a trip once a year, somewhere else in some other part of the world, and did that so that they would have a benefit later on in life to being better educated about the world. Today, I wouldn't do that because I think too many places in the world today, if you could come in there and say you're an American, instead of them saying we're glad to see you, we respect you so much in your country, they say, well, you're an American, we don't like you, we want to harm you. And we've got a long ways to go to regain the credibility that we are a nation, a free nation who believes in freedom for all people, and we've got to do something about it or I don't know where we're headed.
How do we go about fixing that?
I think we're going to have to do what we said earlier in the 60s. We're going to have to elect more enlightened leadership in this country in order to do that.
Philosophically speaking, in the bigger picture, what are the marks of a good governor? What are the benchmarks that make a good governor?
Well, I think he first has to understand the government, and he has to understand that he's representing all of the people of the state. And secondly, I think he's got to lay out in front of him and in front of the people that he's serving a program that they understand. And then thirdly, I think he's got to be willing to pay the price, to whatever it takes, to work as hard as he needs to work to implement the program that he has run on. And most people sometimes get the impression, I think, that they can run on some issues and then once they get elected they can discard those issues and forget about them. I think a good governor's got to stick to his guns and stick to his programs and tell people that he's doing exactly what he told them he would do when he ran and asked them to vote for him. And I think if you abandon that process and you say, well, I may have said that, but I lied, I shouldn't have said what I said, you never make a good governor. And you got to be independent enough where you're willing to accept the fact that you're not going to win every battle and you're not going to be able to accomplish everything that you feel like you would like to accomplish, but you got to be willing to say, if I lose a battle, I'll win another one, and I'll keep on till I accomplish what I said I'd accomplish when I went in front of the people and said, elect me, and I'll do what I said I'd do if you elect me.
Are there any governors since your term in office that have distinguished themselves in meeting these benchmarks that you've laid out?
Well, I think a lot of them have. It depends on what you mean by distinguishing themselves. I don't know of anybody right off the top of my head that I think has not distinguished themselves in the office. I just think that they haven't had the tools or the power to work with that I had. Now, Zell Miller, when he was governor, did something, when he ran for governor, did something that I probably would not have done. He ran on creating a state lottery. And of course, I thought that was sort of living in the Bible Belt and living in this thing. I didn't think that was a very good political issue, but he got elected on that and created the Hope Scholarship, which has been a tremendous program. George Busby, Joe Frank Harris, Roy Barnes, they've all been good governors in my opinion. They just, some of them have been impeded with a reluctant Speaker of the House or a reluctant Lieutenant Governor at times, and they just maybe haven't been able to accomplish as many things as they would like to have accomplished.
How much effect do you think that the press has on the effectiveness of a governor?
Oh, the press has a lot of influence. The press can take a piece of straight bread every day and twist it into a French roll. And if they twist it, there's not much you can do about it. You can say something, and if they twist it the way they want to twist it, it won't look anything like what you said. So the press has a great deal of influence on anybody's public
Now,
service.
has that changed since the 1960s?
Well, I think it's worse now than it was back then. Now they go after your family and they go after you, go into your bedrooms and things like that. Back in that day, in my day and time, they didn't do that.
The press was fairly kind to you in your day.
I thought they were very kind to me.
Well, thank you for your time and speaking with us today.
I enjoyed it. I hope somebody later in history will take the time to listen to it.
Well, thank you very much.